was a wonderful storm this afternoon, and now the sun is out, typically Gauteng or Johannesburg style. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of the University of Johannesburg Senate Academic Freedom Committee, and it really is a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here to say a few words of welcome to everyone. Welcome. Thank you for making the time to actually attend it. A few years ago I served, or I think my claim to fame is that a few years ago I served on this committee, on the Senate Academic Freedom Committee and that's where I actually really got to know Prof. Camilla Naidu as well. And we quite often spoke about such a lecture series, and of course we never brought it to fruit. So it really is very gratifying to see that the Academic Freedom Committee at UJ is doing such amazing work, and that this lecture series now actually is off the ground. The Senate Academic Freedom Committee, of course, is a critical committee or a critical spoke in the university, and in fact in any university. This is a key place where people turn to for advice and for a balanced view on academic freedom. So I think we can never overestimate the important role that this committee plays in the well-being of any university. Jane is, of course, also the ideal person to present the first lecture or the first discussion lecture in such a series. She has a long history around academic freedom debates, and we look forward to her views this afternoon on the topic, also, of course, on 4IR. 4IR is a contentious topic, and I think it's a very apt topic for such a first lecture series. Many are in favor of it, many really don't like it, and they don't appreciate it. UJ's stance, I think, around 4IR for me is a very balanced and a very good one, in that it really advocates inclusiveness around 4IR, and also now the new vision of the new VC that's coming in to use 4IR around societal impact. So in that balanced sense for me, I really do appreciate the UJ stance around 4IR. But I'm sure that there will be quite a bit of lively debate at the end of Jane's presentation and her discussion, and I really look forward to it. But a little bit more about Jane. I'm sure that she doesn't need a lot of introduction, but allow me. So Jane is a professor in the Department of Communications and Media at the University of Johannesburg. She was previously the Executive Director of the Freedom of Expression Institute and has held various other positions, including Chair in Media and Information Society in the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes. Also as a co-director of the Highway Africa Centre. She's the author of many books. If I start reading the titles and the journal publications and opinion pieces, we'll be here for quite a bit. So Jane, let it just suffice to say that there are many. She completed a PhD at the Wits School of Arts in, and I won't say which year, but at the Wits School of Arts. She served on the Academic Freedom Committee of Rhodes University, and she was also the chairperson of that committee for several years. So she brings a wealth of knowledge around academic freedom. During this time, she also represented the Higher Education South Africa, which is now the Universities South Africa, in parliamentary hearings on the protection of the State Information Bill. She's also served on the University of Johannesburg Academic Freedom Committee. Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I do have a full paper on this topic. I'm not going to have an opportunity to present all of it, so I will present the most salient points. So the fourth industrial revolution, or 4IR. I think we're all familiar with the term and its catchy acronym, which is everywhere. Now, this revolution has been touted as the answer to many of South Africa's problems, from the ailing economy to controlling traffic and predicting extreme weather events. Artificial intelligence, or AI, offers a key to South Africa's future, 4IR advocates tell us. We must get with the program or be left behind to languish in global irrelevance. Now, 4IR is very prominent here at the University of Johannesburg, which has branded itself as a 4IR-driven university. So, for instance, if we look at the 2025 UJ strategic plan, it's organized around 5 objectives, which includes developing an international profile for global excellence and stature. So the strategic objective was designed, in the words of the strategic plan, to position UJ as a leader in developing people and technology appropriate for the fourth industrial revolution, as it pertains to the African context. However, and for such a trending topic, there's surprisingly little debate about 4IR and whether it's likely to deliver on what it offers. So in this inaugural lecture of UJ's Senate Academic Freedom Committee, I explore the implications for academic freedom of the turn to 4IR as a concept guiding strategic decision-making in different areas of the state, economy, and society, including academia. Now, I think it's important to set out the provenance of 4IR as it sheds light on the set of ideas that have come to be associated with it. 4IR gained prominence through the World Economic Forum meeting of 2016, which adopted the theme of mastering the fourth industrial revolution. Now, its founder and executive chairman, Klaus Schwab, has been central to advocating for 4IR, as what he maintains is a deep technological shift that is changing society fundamentally because of the fusion of physical, digital, and biological technologies. Now, Schwab describes his perspective as that of a pragmatic optimist, a technology enthusiast, and an early adopter. He's an optimist because he believes that the supposedly new technological revolution qualifies as a transformation of humankind to the point where, in his words, technology and digitization will change everything. He is pragmatic because he recognizes that 4IR contains within it inherent risks that are likely to exacerbate inequality. Unless the shift is empowering and human-centered, he argues, then it may become divisive and dehumanizing. Now, the Vice-Chancellor of UJ, Tshilidzi Marwala, has approached Schwab's pragmatic advocacy of 4IR from the perspective of someone who is concerned about the potential for further marginalization of the African continent. Now, for Marwala, 4IR will usher in the problem of human irrelevance and shrink the world of work. Now, like Schwab, Marwala believes that emerging economies can use 4IR to leapfrog stages of development to become transformational, making a quick jump by harnessing technology to the point of doubling economic growth rates. He warns South Africans that, in his words from his recent book, our participation in this revolution will not be optional. Either we participate, or as a country, we are economically obliterated, relegated to the dustbin of history. Now, as a country, we've been warned about the need to get with the technological program or risk falling into the dustbin of history before. In fact, to an extent, we've seen this particular movie before, and it was called the Third Industrial Revolution, 3IR, or the Information Society, or the Knowledge Economy. Important lessons can be extrapolated from how 3IR turned out. Now, in the late 1990s and at the start of the noughties, various multilateral institutions promoted 3IR as a panacea for development challenges in Africa. They advocated for the diffusion of ICTs to achieve what they referred to as an inclusive information society. Countries reliant on agriculture and mining, which were especially susceptible to marginalization during globalization, were convinced into adopting ICT-led growth strategies to leapfrog over the industrial phase of development and straight into the information society and the knowledge economy. Now, attempts to reform 4IR and make it more inclusive, or at that stage, as it was called, 3IR, led to an add ICTs and stir approach to social development that had contradictory outcomes. Many ICT for development projects failed, mainly because they were supply-driven and not demand-led, and relied on techno-fixes to development problems. Structural weaknesses in developing countries sharpened, exacerbating unemployment, and development priorities became even more distorted than they were, fueling perverse growth. Now, in South Africa, expensive telecentres and multi-purpose ICT centres were rolled out in various rural areas, and while there were some successes, many failed. These fell into disuse, as residents were unable to adapt them to everyday needs. At times, implementing agencies overlooked the need for more basic services, such as electricity and transportation, which reduced usage even further. They delivered ICT projects without sufficient consideration for whether there were the capabilities or even the interest to use them, and were expensive to run as they offered multiple services, yet many people could not afford or did not know how to use these facilities. This equipment was provided on a top-down basis, irrespective of local needs, because the assumption was that where ICTs were provided, development would flow. Now, why is this history of 3IR important to remember? Because it suggests how 4IR may turn out if it is allowed to drive social development. Now, for me, 4IR represents not just a set of ideas or even a discourse. It is an ideology, and a dominant one at that adopts particular positions on the roles of technology in society and how societies change. In order to see why 4IR can be characterized in this way, it's necessary to delve into some of the ideas that underpin 4IR and that were so relevant to 3IR too, and why these ideas are so deeply problematic. The first set of ideas are technological optimism and solutionism. Now, while highly critical of the dangers of the technologies associated with 4IR, the kinds of views put forward by Schwab and Marwala could be understood as technological optimism and technological determinism, or the tendency to have an abiding faith in technology to change society for the better, and the belief that the mere adoption of technology will drive social change and offer solutions to social problems. Now, technology optimism and its close cousin, technological solutionism, have a long history. In contemporary communication studies, they've found support from the likes of Clay Shirky, who in the wake of the Arab Spring was enthused by the potential of digital media to empower citizens rather than just governments and corporations. These events led him to believe that the internet truly could change the world for the better. However, as the Arab Spring unwound and became a bitter winter, and as the open internet became enclosed by more and more corporations and governments, Shirky's optimism wore thin. Evgeny Morozov characterized Shirky's views as technological solutionism, as a dominant ideology, together with internet centrism. Here, he was referring to an unhealthy preoccupation with simplistic technological solutions or fixes to complex problems, often displayed by governments and corporations, and driven by the optimism about technology's ability to change society. Now, such technological solutionism can have unexpected consequences and actually cause more damage to the very problems they are being designed to solve, including, in Morozov's words, reaching for an answer before questions have been fully asked. Now, when we apply these arguments to AI, for instance, just because AI can be used in a variety of areas of life doesn't mean to say that it should be. We need to be wary of the tendency to recast all complex social problems as problems begging for computable solutions if only the right algorithm can be put in place. In other words, we need to ask and answer critical questions about how necessary algorithms are in all domains of life, and be alive to the dangers of AI as hype. The second idea I want to touch on is technological determinism. Now, closely related to technological optimism and solutionism is technological determinism. That is, the idea that without adopting the latest technologies, societies will fall behind and even fail. This idea assumes that asking questions about algorithmic necessity is regressive, because mere deployment of the technology will deliver the change as it assigns to technology the ability to solve problems. Ways of thinking about the necessity of technological development and deployment are made to appear natural and inevitable, or having universal validity or significance. So for Bridget Kenny, Africa is a continent that is portrayed increasingly as in danger of being left behind in the race to embrace 4IR technologies. She describes this approach as a teleology of technology, where there is one and only one linear path to development, littered with the latest technological developments, which are autonomous from cultural developments while offering utopian futures. However, experiences with 3IR highlight some of the pitfalls of the technology-first approach. In the case of 4IR, injudicious and corporate-led adoption of AI is likely to lead to a society where life-changing decisions about people become incomprehensible, with little democratic oversight, which can reinforce power imbalances. Surveillance is likely to become the norm, especially in countries where the law lag is a real problem. The next concept I want to touch on is epochalism, or conflating historical shifts with epochal shifts. Now, Morozov also critiqued what he referred to as an intellectual fallacy called epochalism, where technological transformations are presented as unprecedented and therefore revolutionary. Now, Raymond Williams has distinguished between epochal shifts and historical shifts, where the former involves identifying the large features of particular epochs and shifts in those features, such as transitions from feudalism to capitalism and capitalism to socialism. However, the latter involves shifts in the different phases of bourgeois society, or different moments within those phases, but where the fundamental characteristics in the development of that society still remain intact. Now, what Morozov is critiquing is the tendency of technology optimists like Shirky to conflate the two and assume that historical shifts in the means of communication enabled by the internet qualify as fundamental epochal shifts in how society is organized. Now, according to Morozov, the paralyzing influence of epochalism induces passivity and limits our responses to change, for the unfolding trends are perceived to be so monumental and inevitable that all resistance seems futile. Now, epochalism often involves the insertion of a novel buzzword into public discourse to cement the public perception that what we are witnessing is, in fact, a true break from previous forms of social organization. Now, periodizing historical epochs according to technological innovations only is reductive, because it ignores the complex factors that drive epochal changes and the nature of societal orders. There are more continuities with earlier moments in history, such as growing inequality, uneven development, and neocolonialism, financialization, and climate exploitation, than there are changes. As Tim Unwin has argued, the interests underlying the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution are largely the same as those driving the economic, social, and political systems of the previous 400 years. Market expansion and a reduction of labor costs through the use of technology. It is these interests, rather than the technologies themselves, that are of the most importance. Now, the technological changes alluded to in 3IR and 4IR do not, to my mind, qualify as revolutions, as they have not disrupted existing inequalities fundamentally. While digitization of many areas of life has intensified and technological innovations have advanced, the underlying oppressive and exploitative social relations remain largely as they were. 3IR and 4IR are both based on the assumption that there is one aspect of society, the technological aspect, which is above the realm of politics and therefore cannot be influenced by social struggle. 4IR and 3IR offer attractive concepts for those who do not want to confront the complex systemic nature of development problems, but still want to appear as though they are committed to revolutionary social transformation. These concepts allow governments to proclaim a revolution even before it has happened, and talk the revolution talk without walking the revolution walk. Now, 4IR fails to acknowledge that active citizens can and should contest and change how technologies are deployed in society if they have negative impacts. In other words, it fails to recognize the power of human agency in shaping technology's take-up. If one accepts that the shifts to 3IR or 4IR are not inevitable but guided by political choices, then one must accept that policymakers can make different political choices. Now, we need to ask ourselves, what do we give causal primacy to? Social relationships and productive relations, or technological innovation? 3IR and 4IR give causal primacy to technological innovation and assign it revolutionary potential. Now, as argued already, to say that we are in a new historical period is an overstatement unsupported by empirical evidence. Emphasizing this point means opening space for the appropriate deployment of digital technologies, freed from much of the pressure of having to run the technology race for its own sake. Now, it's been argued that there are ways of mitigating the dangers associated with 4IR. The real dangers, however, are not about robots taking over the world, as sci-fi movies would have us believe, but the everyday inequalities that could be made worse by these technologies. As Virginia Eubanks has argued, poor people disproportionately are targets rather than beneficiaries of algorithmic decision-making, which is often trialled in what she refers to as low-rights environments. Now, one answer to these problems, the argument goes, lies in collecting more data to correct algorithmic biases. This is especially so on the African continent, where the lack of representation in data sets poses particular risks to Africans. As Marwala has argued, we ought to start collecting data in all areas of national importance. Data is the new oil in the 4IR, he argues, and so we need to invest in data collection technologies. Now, this strategy, Marwala continues, should also include building businesses that advance Africa's business interests, including homegrown social media networks. Other proposed strategies include strengthening ethical decision-making, AI regulation and privacy policy, and improving people's control over their own data. Now, I'll address each of these mitigation strategies one by one. Collecting data in all areas of national importance is not necessarily a solution to the problems I've identified. As I've argued, technological determinism can lead to data being collected and processed, even when it's not appropriate. A case in point is facial recognition, often embedded into smart CCTV cameras and rolled out increasingly as part of smart and safe city strategies. Now, it's a well-known problem that the algorithms used in facial recognition software have been trained using mainly faces of white and older people. Now, these problems increase the potential for false positives or negatives and can lead to race and age-based profiling, and even black and younger people being falsely accused of crimes. Now, a technologically determinist approach would steer engineers towards improving the algorithms, which would mean collecting more data of the social groups marginalized in the existing data sets. However, doing so does not address the principled question of whether it is appropriate to encourage a society where individuals cannot have a reasonable expectation of privacy in public spaces. Now, another case in point is bulk signals intelligence surveillance, which allows state intelligence agencies to scoop up vast amounts of personal communication data into a dragnet, even where there is no reasonable suspicion of criminality. Now, the most powerful SIGINT agencies, grouped into the Five Eyes Alliance, are attempting to collect as much data as possible in case they miss information about future terrorist attacks, for instance. But is such an aspiration appropriate if it means that we will never be able to enjoy a reasonable expectation of privacy in our communications? And this in a situation where the effectiveness of untargeted bulk surveillance in detecting and disrupting major national security threats is very much in question. As former National Security Agency contractor and whistleblower Edward Snowden has argued, I don't want to live in a society that does these sorts of things. I do not want to live in a world where everything I do and say is recorded. That is not something I'm willing to support or live under. Now, what kind of society do we want to live in, and how do we achieve such a society, is surely the primary question of our times. It is a question that surely should precede and not follow questions such as, how do we catch up with the technological race towards AI, blockchain, the Internet of Things, wearables, and the like? And how do we collect as much data as possible in areas of national importance? Now, answers to the first question may or may not include deploying these technologies, but they do open up possibilities where these technologies are deployed more sensitively and appropriately, and data is collected more judiciously, if at all, because we have stopped giving causal primacy to technology take-up as the main driver of change. Sometimes decisions must be taken not to collect data in areas of national importance, precisely because they have that status. Furthermore, there are real dangers in focusing on collecting more data as a solution to the problems of AI bias and many other areas of life where inequality is reproduced, if the larger problems of data ownership and control are not addressed. Failure to do so can become merely another argument for extractivism, even if the extraction is by African companies and not US ones. Now, certainly there's a need to build local capacity to produce and process data. Failure to do so can force countries with limited to no technological capacity, especially in the global south, into dependence on technology firms often located elsewhere, especially in the global north. However, without changing how we view data, namely as a private resource with economic value rather than as a public resource, then arguments to develop an African industry can lead to the substitution of one set of capitalist data monopolies with another. Now, in that regard, growing calls to recognize data as part of the commons, where value is regained by citizens, and AI as a public or community utility, rather than as the new oil to be exploited by the 4IR versions of Shell or BP, seem apposite. This data commons could be a shared resource and not appropriated privately. Rather than following the smart city hype, some local councils, such as Barcelona, have experimented with non-market-based cooperative data projects using AI to track noise pollution and improve air quality. Furthermore, I think as a country we need to have meaningful conversations about what work should be automated and what work should not. The drive towards automation is not inevitable, and different choices can be made. After all, technology does not change society. People change society. They may do so with the assistance of technology, but the primary drivers of change remain people. Now, when it comes to looking to data protection regulators to mitigate the dangers of a 4IR, such regulators the world over are often pretty bad at data protection for a variety of reasons. Invariably, there are massive information asymmetries between data companies and regulators, which typically prioritize individual control over personal data, while ignoring the larger constraints on the right to privacy. In reality, individuals often have little understanding of how their data is being processed and find it all but impossible to navigate the complex privacy notices that companies provide. These regulators often fail to consider whether particular forms of data processing should even take place at all. Broad-ranging carve-outs on criminal justice or national security grounds further limit data rights. All these problems could lead to the conclusion that data protection regulators may create the illusion of data control rather than actual control. Now, this is not to say that these regulators shouldn't be established. They should. But one has to be realistic about their ability to mitigate the dangers associated with 4IR. Then there's also the argument that AI ethics are meant to address problems of abuses and bias. However, in the proliferation of guidelines on AI ethics, what has become apparent is a bias towards a liberal political framework. As Cole has argued, the current debate on AI ethics in the literature tends to be limited by ontological, epistemological, and political assumptions drawn from classical liberal thought, namely around rights and privacy. The horizon of these principles takes certain conditions as given: private ownership of the means of production, capitalist social relations, the institutional reproduction of such relations, the individualist perspective on decision-making and responsibility, and the embeddedness of technologies within this context. As a result, many participants in the debate have only been able to consider courses of action which fall within these limitations. These limitations call not just for an AI ethics, but an AI politics. Such a politics needs to consider how power is organized in society and the ways in which such organization is likely to ensure that AI will continue to be deployed differentially. Now, this is not to say that computational power cannot be deployed for social justice. But as Virginia Eubanks has shown through her research, even well-meaning interventions, such as using AI to allocate housing to the homeless in the US, can rely too much on a systems engineering approach, which assumes that complex social problems can be solved by obtaining the right information. And political conflict results primarily from a lack of information. But as Eubanks argues, this is not how politics work. Political conflicts are more than informational. They're about values, group membership, and balancing conflicting information. Now, failing to address the limitations of mitigation strategies can lead to 4IR becoming a new form of social control that is reconstructing the workplace and society in ways that shift the balance of power even further away from people and towards governments, an increasingly monopolized corporate power, and a means of lifting the global capitalist crisis out of its slump rather than changing how it actually functions. To the extent that this is so, then it could be considered more a dominant and conservative ideology than a revolutionary one. Now, what are the implications for academic freedom of 4IR having become so central to the academic project of universities like UJ? Answering this question involves us answering prior questions about what academic freedom is in South Africa and what it should be. Now, academic freedom in South Africa has long been associated with what has become known as the T.B. Davey formulation. Now, T.B. Davey was the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town between 1948 to 1955, where the National Party regime was in its ascendancy. Now, for Davey, academic freedom meant our freedom from external interference in who shall teach, what we teach, how we teach, and who we teach. It was a product of its times, as it understood academic freedom as a negative right, or as a freedom from external interference, mainly by the then apartheid regime. Now, in circumstances of continuing poverty and inequality, to assert academic freedom as a form of institutional autonomy mainly appears increasingly like a luxury and an argument for ivory tower elitism. Now, the Kampala Declaration on Intellectual Freedom and Responsibility offers an alternative vision for academic freedom. Developed in 1990 by a group of African researchers associated with Codisria, the declaration was meant to protect the right to academic autonomy from attack by structural adjustment programs and increasingly authoritarian governments, while at the same time recognizing the sector's developmental responsibility to broader society. So to this end, the declaration states that the intellectual community has the responsibility to participate in the struggle of the popular forces for their rights and emancipation. It also argues that members of the intellectual community have a responsibility to promote the spirit of tolerance towards different views and positions and enhance democratic debate and discussion. And the intellectual community is obliged to encourage and contribute to affirmative action to redress historical and contemporary inequalities based on gender, nationality, or any other social disadvantage. Now, undoubtedly, it's still important to protect academic freedom as a freedom from external constraints. Furthermore, the space to conduct intellectual inquiry without a particular direction of thought in mind and free from utilitarian pressures needs to be protected, as valuable and unexpected new knowledge is often developed in such conditions. However, academic freedom in the South African context needs to move beyond a freedom from approach and address the conditions of knowledge production and social conditions more generally. Now, as the Kampala Declaration has made clear, a university promoting a grand intellectual project cannot be considered a threat to academic freedom per se. In fact, doing so may be necessary for that university to meet its obligations to society. However, this grand project should not be allowed to crowd out debates about the diversity of ideologies or critiques of dominant ideas. Public universities are funded largely by the taxpayer, which places on them obligations to support diverse viewpoints and critical engagements with ideologies, particularly dominant ideologies of the day, such as 4IR. Now, considerable resources are being directed to promoting 4IR in academia, and in the case of UJ, it has become the defining idea of the university, where resources are being poured into branding and public relations using 4IR framing. Now, the Kampala Declaration calls for the intellectual community to promote the spirit of tolerance towards different views and positions and enhance democratic debate and discussion. However, I understand the turn to 4IR as leading to an inappropriate narrowing of the intellectual agenda in academia. It is also a grand project that is not appropriate for South Africa with its massive challenges. A grand academic project that is emancipatory, broadly speaking, and that focuses on the main social fault lines of today, namely the elimination of inequalities, addressing the climate catastrophe and growing xenophobia, including through appropriate technology take-up, would be a much more fitting and in fact compelling vision to unite around. However, this project should also protect the space for ideological contestation about how to do so. As things stand, the emphasis on 4IR has become stifling, eclipsing even the earlier and much more apposite focus on decolonization, and demoralizing for those who have sound ideological differences with it. Now, the Kampala Declaration involves articulating a vision for academic work that commits itself to dismantling inequalities and creating conditions for people to participate meaningfully in society as full human beings. But as things stand, there is one main pathway to eliminating inequalities, which is 4IR. As I've argued, 4IR is an ideology that is likely to take us in the opposite direction, and therefore limits academic freedom in the positive sense. This is not a limitation in the conventional sense, through censorship, but through the gradual crowding out of ideologies that call for less deterministic and more context-sensitive approaches to technology take-up. This crowding out takes the form of incentivizing more and more activities that support 4IR and rewarding those activities through strategic support of research funding to 4IR, the creation of 4IR-related posts, and the rewarding of research and the setting of performance criteria that match the 4IR agenda. Now, in such circumstances, and in the everyday activities of the university, 4IR becomes a cloak that smothers other academic activities, which are rendered less visible or even invisible, even if they are socially valuable. In circumstances where resources are limited, the temptation exists for students and academics desperate for opportunities to massage their work to fit into 4IR priorities, even if they don't understand or even believe in the ideology, because that is where the money lies. In other words, we should be concerned about the distorting effects of 4IR. We should be most concerned about the crowding out of emergent and oppositional cultures and ideologies, as it is these that are more likely the ones that represent the interests of groups that do not exercise social power. Universities cannot afford to become the academic branches of the World Economic Forum, because then they become little more than market universities. Now, technologically determinist grant projects are not new to academia. The National Commission on Higher Education Training hitched universities to 3IR, or the knowledge economy, some time ago. However, its doing so was not without contradictions, as the Commission also recognized in its Framework for Transformation document that the task of higher education is to support a healthy public opinion and vibrant public debate by developing a culture of critical discourse in society. This turn to 3IR and 4IR has intersected in unfortunate ways with universities being cast in terms of human capital theory as knowledge trainers, to borrow Raymond Williams's term, where they are expected to produce the labour market with the competencies for the capitalist economy. There are real dangers in a narrow economistic approach towards education, as the university can become reduced to an element in the reproduction of ruling elites. Now, Manuel Castells, problematically, has argued for a role for universities as a productive force in the informational economy, yet even he recognized the dangers of economism, arguing that universities will always be, at the same time, conflictual organizations, open to the debates of society and thus to the generation and confrontation of ideologies. Now, it can be argued that a university should not be put at the service of an ideology, period. However, it's entirely possible to have a diversity of ideologies while still promoting a grand project. Again, the Kampala Declaration provides guidance on how to manage this tension by stating that the autonomy of institutions of higher education shall be exercised by democratic means of self-government, involving active participation of all members of the respective academic community. In other words, there needs to be extensive consultation on the grand project to be adopted. And in terms of the adoption of the grand project, so that consensus is built and the project is owned by the broader academic community, rather than being implemented on a top-down basis. Now, I think despite my deep reservations about 4IR as an academic project to unite around, I do believe that there's urgent need for education on the technologies associated with 4IR. This can and in fact should be done by delinking these technologies from 4IR as the ideology that places them at the front and center of social change, and their value debated in ways that are neither techno-optimist nor technophobic, but techno-realist. Now, an educational strategy around AI, for instance, needs to demystify AI decision-making and expose its human dimensions so that AI users can challenge decisions or impacts. It should also put the social cost of automation at the front of the strategy, while reducing and ultimately eliminating what David Graeber has referred to as bullshit jobs, and improving the quality of life. Independent research is needed on which jobs should be automated and which not, and why, before automation is rolled out. There also needs to be an open engagement between AI engineers and AI users about the lack of access to the rules of the game underpinning AI-driven platforms and websites. And universities can potentially be rich environments for such engagements. In fact, the guiding principles for such intervention should not be whether they advance 4IR, but algorithmic necessity. In other words, are these technologies needed to make society more just and equal? And if so, how can they best be designed and governed? There are other ideas that I go into about what a non-4IR related educational program could look like on technologies that are traditionally associated with 4IR, but I don't really have time to present on those. Perhaps it will come up in question time. But I think suffice to say that there's a great deal of work that needs to be done on these issues. However, my argument is that 4IR holds little, if any, explanatory value as a periodizing concept, as it is a historically inaccurate descriptor of the current period, a distraction, and ultimately a dead-end concept. If that is the case, then it is not even necessary for 4IR to enter the debate for such education to happen. It may even misdirect and ultimately derail these efforts. As Shoshana Zuboff has argued in her extended critique of surveillance capitalism, I reject inevitability, and it is my hope that as a result of our journey together, you will too. We are at the beginning of this story, not the end. If we engage the oldest questions now, there is still time to take the reins and redirect the action towards a human future that we can call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I think can we give her another round of applause? That was brilliant. Okay, so my name's Joost. I'm the chair of the SAFC, and so I've got the privilege of chairing this discussion. So can I take this mic and go and sit down, because I don't really like standing up. Right, so for people who are listening online, please type your questions in the chat box, and I will try and make sure some of them get addressed. But first, I will take some questions from the floor, but even before that, I'm going to take my own privilege while you're still thinking and ask you a couple of questions. I always do that. I should have warned you. I've got loads of things I could talk about, and I think there's a lot there, and there's a lot that you said that will have a lot of traction, I imagine, with people in this room and around the university because of the peculiar place of UJ in relation to the 4IR scene, let's put it that way. But my questions are a bit more specific. When you were talking about 3IR, I was thinking back to a lecture that I mentioned to you earlier that I had to give about digital arts earlier this year, which is kind of outside my field, really. And I found myself thinking about periods of a periodization of how people think about new technologies, and particularly in relation to 3R. So I was thinking about how in the 90s there was this kind of techno-optimism. Thinking of people like Donna Haraway, who kind of imagined that, we could overcome gender asymmetry because everybody could make themselves online, right? This kind of 90s, when I was a student, actually, this techno-optimism. And then in the 2000s, suddenly the internet becomes this dark and dangerous place. And this is because of, the dark web, pornography, but also terrorism and security. Suddenly, And it seemed to me that in the 2010s, maybe 2020s, something has changed. We've moved on from the debate around techno-optimism or pessimism, specifically as it relates to, say, the internet, because I think techno-optimism or pessimism relies on the possibility to imagine a time when the internet didn't exist, or the mobile phones didn't exist. And when I talk to my daughter, who's 13, the idea of a world without mobile phones or the internet, it just doesn't even come into the picture. So I'm kind of curious about whether the techno-realism we're talking about really is about an aspect of normalization, when technologies that are seen as new at a particular moment suddenly become so normalized that imagining an alternative no longer is a possibility, and then we kind of move on from the optimism or pessimism debates. And then I was wondering whether really we should call that techno-fatalism, actually, and whether that would fit into your kind of arguments around the way in which technology is normalized. So that's one question. Now, I have a load more, but I don't want to ask them all. I think the other one really had to do with the language of rupture. And I think you're right. I think often we use a language, historians do this all the time. I work on Zimbabwe, everyone says 2000, everything changed. Yeah, but actually, most of the changes gain meaning in traction with longer continuities. So in terms of 3IR, there are obvious continuities, political, economic, social. But what are the continuities that you can envisage vis-a-vis this thing that's being called 4IR? And I guess to give you a hint, the one I was thinking about was the way in which a language of security is often used to activate a whole series of interventions in people's lives that are deemed non-political. So I'll leave you with those two questions, and maybe you can answer them, and then if people could just give me a little wave if they have a question, I'll start a list going here.
Thanks. I would tend to agree that there has been a normalization of the internet over the past 2 decades, that we also have a generation of people now who don't know a world without the internet or without living online. And I would also agree that you could characterize that as techno-fatalism rather than techno-realism, because I think techno-realism is something different, certainly in this context. Techno-realism is not promoting technology as being the only driver of social change, what we would associate with techno-optimism. It's not thinking that the technologies that we're speaking about are nasty and evil. A kind of assumption that the technologies themselves are somehow regressive. But techno-realism is about recognizing that they can have both advantages and disadvantages for how society functions, and being able to assess those advantages and disadvantages without having either rose-tinted glasses or unnecessarily pessimistic views of how those technologies can change societies. That, for me, is what is meant by techno-realism. Also, techno-realism, I think, is about recognizing that unless there's pushback against how the internet is organized, and unless there's an attempt to try and claw back some of the government and corporate enclosure of the internet, we're not really going to get to the kind of earlier optimistic possibilities of the open internet that I think dominated so much of the discourse in the late 1990s. So certainly, I wouldn't understand the argument that's being made here as an argument that equates techno-realism with techno-fatalism. It's not. It's a very different kind of perspective. And then in relation to the language of rupture, I'm just trying to understand the question. Can you perhaps just repeat it or rephrase it?
I mean, in short, I was talking about how you emphasize the continuities that are hidden by this language of rupture. And I guess I was probing you to ask, well, what are these continuities that you envisage? And I gave you a hint because I was particularly interested in how the language of security might be one of these continuities. Sure,
yes, all right. Well, I think an example is actually provided in the Fuller paper by Sasha Moja-Noble, where she speaks about how racism has actually been baked into the way that algorithms are used in search engines. Now, we have a global legacy of racism lasting many centuries. We have a global legacy of racism lasting many centuries. That is an example of a continuity that exists to this day, but amplified by the possibilities that are provided by algorithms. Neocolonialism is another example as well. there's a whole body of literature around data colonialism and the way in which, yes, data has literally become the new oil, but in the sense that countries in the global south, including on the African continent, are having their data extracted and exploited in ways that benefit corporations in the global north. That is an example, of a continuity where colonial relationships are now being reinforced and reproduced in the through the technologies traditionally associated with 4IR.
Excellent. Right. Thanks. Excellent. I've got Patrick with a question. Anyone else have a question? I'd like to take 3 at once, if possible. Yeah, Patrick, come.
Well, I'm just continuing the bias. I'm also Academic Freedom Committee member. I'm very proud and very happy that Jane has done such a great talk. Jane's also written probably the finest book on social protest. So when you say there's techno-optimism, techno-pessimism, techno-realism, isn't there techno-socialism on your horizon? A potential fourth industrial counter-revolution that would, you're laughing, could you imagine going on the highways where you're annoyed about surveillance? You don't want to pay e-tolls because you know it's Sanral ripping you off, they didn't consult. And it's an Austrian company, Kapsch, that's taking money, and they're watching you everywhere. That fourth industrial revolution has been defeated last week. It's thrown away because of about 87% of you in this room, if the statistics hold, said that when you got caught on camera. I know because you looked at your photograph when it came in with the bill. And to me, plus the terrible defeat we just had at the WTO, where we tried to socialize technology in the form of COVID-19 vaccine waivers on the intellectual property. And even, I say even advisedly, President Cyril Ramaphosa, Prime Minister Modi couldn't defeat the 4IR forces in Big Pharma that need intellectual property. But 21 years ago, today, in Doha, the Treatment Action Campaign and their allies did have a techno-socialism, their fourth industrial counter-revolution against Big Pharma on AIDS medicines had the effect of raising our life expectancy from 52 to 65. And I guess this is the point where you have to give all the respect, I'm sure we all do in the House, to Fees Must Fall, because they fought for insourcing workers, they fought for free education for the working class, they won. What they didn't win might be the most important of the fourth industrial counter-revolutionary objectives. I don't know if you'd agree. They didn't want to see their education commodified, and they didn't want to be neo-colonial tools where they're simply being trained to go out into the corporate world to get a job. So they demanded decolonization. And I think that is actually the antidote that would help us do not the rejection of the 4IR, but its socialization. I wonder if you'd agree or disagree, being an expert also on protest. And the question for us all as academics, shouldn't we study the protesters? What are they telling us? Thanks.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Because that's quite a big one.
Hello, hi, my name is Dante Colta. I'm the HOD of the Academy of Computer Science and Software Engineering. So I'm just talking to the point that you brought up about demystifying artificial intelligence. Maybe it links back to the previous question as well about counter-revolution to the trends that we're sort of seeing at the moment. It might just help to know, you mentioned that people should know the rules of the game that they're being judged by. And it might be that due to the choices of technologies that we're using, that the rules might be unknowable, because the nature of the techniques that have sort of gained traction in the last 10, 20 years is that they tend to produce models that are relatively opaque. We don't quite know why they make the decisions they make. There's a whole field of research to try and make more explicable decision-making models where a human being can understand how a decision was reached rather than just what the decision was. But maybe if people lend more heavily into the fact that it might be difficult for many people to justify the decisions that are being taken because of the nature of the technologies that are making those decisions, that could be an avenue for pushing back against that. Thanks.
Wow, you've got a lot there. Jane, and I think you could probably answer it, but I might guide you a little bit in terms of, my comeback to Patrick would be, well, what you're talking about is like the romanticization of the internet hacker as an anarchist freedom fighter. That would be my response to do we think protesters really think they can make the system, make the matrix work for them? I don't know. That would be a quick response. It might be easier just to clog up the system with nonsense data. But let me give a hand over to you.
Thanks. I don't see techno-socialism and techno-realism as being incompatible. I think if you have a very good grounded sense of what so-called 4IR technologies can deliver, what the internet can deliver, but what needs to change in order to make them deliver in a more socially relevant way, then that could lead you into an argument for techno-socialism. And I think I have touched on some of the elements of techno-socialism in the paper, where I speak as understanding data as not as a private resource, but as a commons, having a discussion about ownership and control of companies that exploit data. I've given the example of Barcelona, perhaps not imperfect, but attempting to experiment with a cooperative approach towards using data so that it is not being privately appropriated and exploited in the way that we often find in conventional smart cities. So I think that, those kinds of principles of treating data and the utilities that make use of data as being part of the commons, as being community-owned and controlled, publicly owned and controlled rather than privately appropriated, I think are steps towards the socialization of these technologies. I must say, however, that I have discomfort with your articulation of 4IR counter-revolution. And I still stand by my argument that the rejection of 4IR as a concept is more apposite in the circumstances. Because the problem with speaking about 4IR counter-revolution is that, for one thing, I don't like the term counter-revolution. It conjures up regressive social changes, along the lines of what we saw in Chile with the subverting and the overthrowing of the Allende government, with the Pinochet government. That, to my mind, is what I think about when I hear the term counter-revolution. It's full of negative and regressive connotations, so I would tend to avoid that particular term. But the problem with speaking about 4IR counter-revolution, the role of social protests and what have you within that, is that it still reinforces the logic of 4IR. It still recognizes the fact that 4IR is a legitimate periodizing concept. So in other words, we periodize moments in history and epochal moments in history according to the technologies that they have thrown up. And I'm sure you'd agree with me that that is quite a reductive way of characterizing particular historical epochs. So while I really do understand the reasons why you are raising the issue in the way that you are in your advocacy of the term 4IR counter-revolution, it does leave me with some discomfort.
Thank you, that's a great response. Do we have any more questions in the room? There is a question that's come online, but it's a little bit off point, so I'm going to address, Jace, I'm going to address your question in a minute, but are there any more questions in the room? Yes, gentleman at the back.
Thank you. My name is Marwala, Department of Sociology. So thank you, Jane, for a really brave and enlightening presentation. There's a few things I learned, such as Yeah, so that's very interesting. Yeah, but I agree with you there. Yeah, so I just want you to say more about, because you said towards the end you've got more ideas how we could take forward these, these technological developments. You don't have time. And then I just want to make a comment that could it be that, but I think that's your argument, that the way 4IR has been presented, at least here at UJ, maybe there's a bit of overkill, a kind of veneration and claiming more than what you can achieve. I think you even said a grand project. Later you said an ideology. So I think maybe you can remove, the packaging. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm answering the question I asked you to tell us more. You could remove that packaging, maybe things would be better, more accessible, more debate, rather than, feeling under pressure, you accept or reject. Because, I don't really feel that way about it. I just think, it's maybe a great idea by our Vice-Chancellor. Probably it's got some good things, some bad things, but I can see how it can actually start a debate and make people feel like it's being imposed, especially if the funding streams now require you to insert 4IR. But I'm just saying maybe it can be rescued. And then my last point is, my concern was with managerialism and 4IR. For example, how we do, I see the gene is there, so I must be careful. how we do our KPIs through the drop-down menus. Yeah, so I just felt that being restrictive, they don't give us a choice. So, okay, it's something they discuss, but in the context of this ideology of 4IR, then it becomes a bigger problem. Thank you.
I'm glad for that question, actually, because you take us back to the question of academic freedom and some of the things that we've really been trying to think about in the committee quite a lot. Maybe the problem with 4IR isn't just 4IR, it's just the way in which it's become such a dominant theme in a particular university, so that the whole management system around it means that, if you can't tick the 4IR box in your performance, then you don't get your bonus or you don't get your promotion, whatever. I think that is part of the problem. I think you mentioned it. But I also think might be a bigger problem here, because one of the things there was a moment when I was trying to think positively about 4IR, and I was trying to link it to new debates in my own discipline, anthropology, around materiality, for example, which is about collapsing and overcoming the Cartesian distinctions between signs and what they mean, right? Between matter and meaning. And it seemed to me that 4IR could link us with that very contemporary veil of thought that comes from Deleuze and Guattari that's dominated social sciences for the last 2 decades. So in a positive light, I always thought, well, maybe 4IR is about that. But actually, in your paper, you were talking about data and you were talking about algorithms. And it made me think about how, in the 4IR context, a lot of the time data is presented as this thing, this resource to be extracted, as if data is separate from its interpretation. And the algorithm is this separate thing. But actually, I would have thought that contemporary social theory and philosophy would have collapsed that distinction between data and interpretation a very long time ago. I certainly tell my undergraduate students in anthropology that there is no difference between data and interpretation. We need to really think about how they're intertwined, and the idea of data as something that can be abstracted is absurd, as if it's an objective thing. And yet, the 4IR thing seems to suggest that data is this resource to be extracted as separate from its interpretation. And that might be an even more pernicious effect of 4IR, actually, because it takes us back to a kind of hypermodernism and ignores postmodernism and the steps to get beyond postmodernism. There's a big theoretical question for you.
Thank you. I must apologize profusely to the HOD from, is it software engineering? Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but I neglected to answer your question. And I realized that when Trevor was speaking, because one of the points that he raised, I think, touches directly on the issue that you raised. This is why I think we need a dialogue between the engineers and the humanitarians, because you can explain to us what is explicable and what isn't. So one of the things that, and how to make algorithmic decision-making more explicable and ultimately more accountable, because, you know, one of the big issues at the moment is algorithmic accountability. So one of the things that UNESCO has suggested, for instance, is to start attempting to understand what goes on in the so-called black box by examining the input data and the outputs. So in other words, the data that is going into the black box that forms the basis on which the algorithmic decisions are being made, and what the decisions are that ultimately get spat out the other end. Because that tells us it could potentially tell us a huge amount about the quality of the data that is being fed in to the algorithms, because I'm sure that some companies will push back and say, this is intellectual property, it's proprietorial and what have you. But at the very least, I think we can learn a lot by examining both the input and the output data. And also, you know, there could be some fundamental ground rules that we could agree on as well, which is that there should be, for instance, a prohibition with very narrow exemptions on solely automated decision-making, where such decisions have significant legal or other human rights consequences. There, for instance, we need a human in the loop. But I think it's precisely these kinds of discussions that perhaps we haven't had enough of, precisely because, to my mind, this turn towards 4IR has been very top-down. It hasn't really been owned sufficiently by academics, and had it been owned more by academics, then I think that these kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations that could have allowed us to develop understandings together with one another and allow us to address gaps in our knowledge and understanding that interdisciplinary collaborations allow, then perhaps, you know, we would be further down this particular kind of role. We would be further down this particular kind of road towards determining what actually constitutes algorithmic accountability and how it can actually be brought into being. Now, in relation to the points that Trevor made, I think I've touched a little bit on, I think, some of the education that can take place. So trying to make more transparent and gain more understanding about how often inexplicable algorithms take decisions is absolutely necessary. This is what's known as the black box problem. Because if you don't resolve the black box problem in a meaningful way for people who are the subject of algorithmic decision making, they're not going to trust those decisions. So you actually need to try and find a way of making people understand through education how algorithms are designed often to be opaque and to not allow you to understand how they have been designed. Can 4IR be rescued? You know, when you ask that question, I think back to a summer school that I was part of at Oxford University, where, you know, academics and policymakers and researchers from around the world, people from civil society organizations from around the world came together for 2 weeks in order to discuss some of the major media and communication policy issues of the day, including content moderation, automated content moderation, and how the algorithms just haven't been designed to be able to deal in very effective ways with the problem of extreme speech, including hate speech online. We're very far away from being able to automate these responses to these kinds of problems. And you know, in the entire 2 weeks, it was a very rich 2 weeks of presentations and what have you. And in the entire 2 weeks, 4IR wasn't mentioned once. So the point that I'm making here is that it's entirely possible to have a sensible and deep and solid discussion about these issues without referring to the ideology that actually legitimizes these technologies as being somehow the fundamental drivers of social change. So can we rescue 4IR? The question that I'd pose to you is, do we even need to? And then I've got a question if there's no other questions.
Okay, you have a question? Then ask.
Can we not also take this as an opportunity just as academics on the chalk face? Because I think that there are, quite a few academics here, including online. How do you feel about all of this? How do you feel about some of the issues that Trevor was raising? That now 4IR has become a driver of performance targets, and we now getting assessed, according to our delivery on 4IR strategic objectives. Now, when we upload our publications onto OROS, we have to indicate whether they are 4IR publications or not. I'm not too sure what the implication of that is. The inference is that somehow they're going to be given disproportionate weight, but exactly how, I'm not entirely sure. I've seen on a number of occasions, and perhaps your experiences have been different, but I've seen on a number of occasions, and I've been privy to a number of conversations, involving students and younger researchers who have said, well, if we just put 4IR in there, into our research proposal or into our postgraduate proposal, then we can angle for funding from, GES fund. We can be taken more seriously. Our research can look more topical. And I've grown concerned about that, because sometimes when you push back a little bit and you ask, well, what is your understanding of 4IR? Where is your critical engagement with this particular term? You look at the literature review, you don't really see anything there. You just see the term 4IR that's been parachuted into that particular proposal. This, for me, is the reason why I raised concerns about the distorting effect of this particular concept. And I wonder, to what extent does this worry you as academics? Can we perhaps not use this as an opportunity to start having an open discussion about this? Do we want a grand project? Do we identify with a grand project for the university? And if so, what should that grand project be? How should it be implemented? I think now we've got an opportunity to have a discussion about that and perhaps do some rethinking. There has been a shift towards SDGs that I've noticed, for instance. Do we now want to replace 4IR with SDGs? Because SDGs carries with them a whole set of other problems that I think we also need to have a debate about. But I think perhaps could we use this as an opportunity to start having an open conversation as academics about how we view all of this?
Thank you. I was anticipating quite an interesting and open and lively debate about the topic, and I think this is exactly what we're doing. Jane, just to respond a little bit, I've worked quite a bit around the KPIs and also the reporting of the KPIs as the Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives and Administration. We certainly do report, so I think we certainly do report, and there are many of the KPIs that speak to 4IR. 4IR webinars, and this one will count as one of them. Publications that address the topic or broadly address the topic of 4IR. These are not more heavily weighted than any of the publications. So, when we count publications, we do count publications as in the numbers, we do count the units. But because of the university strategy around 4IR, which we are debating whether that's good or bad, we do track these. Otherwise, how do you measure how you move along a specific strategy? So I don't think it's correct that some are more heavily weighted than others. I do think that one thing that the university did is that it's very it's very broad and open around 4IR, and that perhaps in itself can be a debate, but it really has gone the extra mile to be inclusive and to be open around 4IR, and 4IR in terms of how it's viewed in different fields, because you might come from an angle saying, you know, only the computer sciences or the engineers can actually do 4IR. So I think that 4IR and how we view it is also seen as quite broadly, and it's defined within faculties and it's defined within specific disciplines.
So we're running out of time, but I know there's a question over there, and there are also a couple of questions that I quickly want to at least allude to. I don't think you necessarily need to answer them. But let me also comment that, you know, this is exactly the kind of debate that we have on the Academic Freedom Committee when we meet, and we meet quite regularly. And I think you could also say that regardless of whether 4IR publications are taken into account or not, the fact that the idea is out there that they are already has implications for academic freedom. So I may just add that one of the contributors online, I haven't got my glasses on. Sorry? I'm still getting used to wearing glasses. I didn't need them a year ago. But anyway, the general point is that in my department, it has been raised that it's against academic freedom that we are assessed on our scientific work on 4IR. So regardless of whether we are or not, the idea that it's out there is already a problem. And it does raise bigger issues about how any university, designs its strategy and the kind of involvement it has of its members and staff in designing big strategy and rather than imposing on top. These are big issues, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we at the Academic Freedom Committee spend a lot of time talking about. There's also a comment from Lucy Graham, which is asking for a comment on how new technologies may enable more deliberately leaderless social movements that are less patriarchal, less heteronormative and hierarchical. So this is kind of following that line of discussion we had earlier coming from Patrick about the possibilities that 4IR technologies might offer for kind of new kinds of political social organization that maybe are less authoritarian and maybe more progressive. But I don't expect you to answer that because I'm trying to rush through because our time is running out. There is also a question that's come from Jace Pillay, which is really slightly off the point of this lecture, but it's certainly relevant to the larger question of academic freedom, which is how would you link academic freedom with global issues such as the Russian-Ukraine conflict, Israeli-Palestine situation, xenophobia, etc.? Should academics have the freedom to engage with such issues? That's not a question that it's fair to throw at Jane right now. That wasn't the subject of our lecture. However, I should emphasize that this is actually something we are talking about in the academic freedom, and we have a working group looking exactly, at the moment we have 2 working groups within the committee. One of them is looking at the effects of the Ukraine conflict in terms of exactly what kind of international collaborations should or shouldn't be allowed, whether institutions like UJ should be in the business of allowing or disallowing any collaborations anyway, etc. This is the subject of quite a big task force in the committee and at Senate, and in fact we're meeting tomorrow and we've got other meetings coming up soon. The other working group we've got working at the moment is exactly on the issue of xenophobia in South African universities and how, you know, xenophobia as a structural institutional issue is affecting academic freedom, which is the subject of a recent article by a very prominent South African, Janssen, and it's something that I myself have repeatedly drawn attention to. So that's the subject of another working group. So we are on this, Jace, and thank you for your question. So, sir, you get to ask the final question, and then we hand over to our closing remarks.
Thank you. So, Tim from the Academy of Computer Science, Software Engineering. So, a bit of a comment and then maybe a follow-up question to that. But earlier in your presentation, you mentioned how South Africa is going to be left behind if we don't embrace the fourth industrial revolution, or you cited something that said that. And then there's also comments of how our data itself, that there's misuse of data, and you also mentioned something about how data will surpass the value of all, has that equivalence, right? And I totally agree with that. I think from the university where change can be made as academics, you should not think that at the forefront we can dictate how data is used, right? And how we can manipulate the freedom of data to make sure that it's not, people aren't exploited. Do not think that we are in a good position, maybe it's being presented in the wrong manner, the wrong form, that we are saying, let's push upon you and you have to do it. But maybe if it was, as I think many people have mentioned, if it was packaged a bit different, we could do it. And I speak from a computer science standpoint where I don't want to, as a country, be left behind. Because I think if you look at South Africa, we struggle to even digitize information, which is the third industrial revolution. And if you look at the fourth industrial revolution, I think we're already behind. So the university as a standpoint or the forefront of this, being able to shape change, do you think that gives us a good opportunity to lead the way forward? Or do you think that by us being told what to do, it's hindering us? I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think, as I've suggested, right towards the end of the presentation, I think that a university like UJ has a huge role to play in thought leadership when it comes to these technologies and ensuring that AI, for instance, doesn't continue to become a tool of extraction and exploitation. So very definitely, I think that UJ can play a leading role. But part of playing that leading role in thought leadership is also to recognize when such technologies should not be deployed, or when they should be deployed more judiciously, or when public resources should be channeled towards those particular technological developments at the expense of other, perhaps more basic interventions. And nowhere was that clearer than government's interventions in relation to 3IR, or the Information Society, where huge resources were deployed by the then Department of Communications into the rolling out of these expensive multi-purpose community centres that often couldn't work because the basics weren't available, like electricity, for instance, like the technical know-how, for instance. People would often go there and perhaps use some of the more basic functions, but some of the more complex functions, people just didn't use them. They just fell into disuse. That is an example of inappropriate deployment of technology. And that happened because multipurpose community centres were deployed on a top-down basis. Had there been consultation, and this is where UJ can play a role as well, go out and consult with people about what they would like to see. Like I was saying, there should be a public conversation about what work should be automated and what work shouldn't. Is our banking experience significantly improved because now increasingly AI is being used in order to process more and more banking transactions, and in fact take banking decisions rather than going into the branches and actually interacting with an individual? What has been gained and lost in those kinds of shifts? Could we have done the shift differently? Being panicked about catching up, I think also needs to be moderated somewhat by social needs and the requirement for us to go out and have meaningful conversations about what will genuinely change people's lives. Because if we don't do that and we continue to package data-driven technologies as being absolutely necessary, and we have to get with the program and what have you, which is what 4IR drives us towards, we're going to land up with perverse effects. And inevitably, certain social groups are going to be advantaged and will, as a result, be able to stay ahead of the technological game, but many more will be left behind and locked out. So I think approaching that conversation about who gets to take decisions about the deployment of technologies is absolutely something that UJ should be at the forefront of promoting.
I think that's a really good place for us to stop and to hand over to Shahana, who's going to make the closing remarks and thanks and all of that.
Thank you so much, Sawubona. Dumelang. It's almost the end of our evening. I know it's been very intense and a very, very engaging afternoon. So I want to thank you all for being with us this evening. And I think that, Jane, what you ended off with is really the important questions of the extent to which 4IR is really contributing to addressing inequality and social injustice. And so these are the sort of really important questions that you raised for us, and that we need to look at the extent to which the kinds of technology that we're providing and engaging with is actually meeting human need. And answering those complex social issues that we are faced with on an everyday level. And I think that those really important questions is what I think as a university we need to engage with more. Besides the actual technology and how do we provide the technology, how is it helping us in our lives, in our everyday lives, because we think about the basics that we as South Africans and many other people in the world are facing with, which what you raised a few minutes ago. Electricity. All of us are facing load shedding, and this may not be only our country. We saw it's coming up in the UK, it's happening in other parts of the world, in Zimbabwe. So what are the environmental issues, and does that enable or disable the use of technology? And how does technology contribute to our lives? So I was ending a lecture the one day, and the next class came in, and they were from computer sciences. And the student and I started having a conversation, and he was talking about how we're going to have social workers who are going to be robots. And I thought about this, and of course my initial reaction was, really, is this possible? And then I thought about my everyday experience on an app. When I go onto my F&B app, or I go onto any other app, and the first question is, 1, 2, 3, 4, which of these do you want? And you go to 3, and then you go to 5, and then you go to 7, and then you must go back to the main menu, and you never quite get the answer. And I'm thinking, if I'm someone who's suicidal, and I've got to press all of these buttons, what's going to happen? So the importance of the use of technology, how is it going to enable our lives? And to what extent is it going to reproduce inequalities and social injustice? And these are very, very important questions that you raised, Jane, that we need to really engage on further. We spoke a little bit about the HR system. It's become increasingly dehumanizing, and personally, I find sometimes disrespectful to the actual work that I do, because it kind of elicits tick boxes of things that I may or may not do, and excludes and silences a whole lot of other work that is important, such as social change, which is really an important part of what we do at universities. And to what extent is that social change creating the kinds of society that we want to live in? Are very important things that we need to engage on and influence, not just accept. And I think the broader issues of academic freedom is also mitigated by issues such as race, gender, age, and in a university environment, your status. The extent to which you can engage these systems and challenge these kind of top-down approaches to what is and isn't important is determined by all of these kind of factors. And what are you chasing? NRF ratings, H indexes, and sort of what we have to be doing as a society sometimes gets left behind. So these are just a few things I wanted to kind of reflect on in terms of Jane's very informative, provocative, challenging presentation. Thank you, Jane, for taking the time to share this with us and to bring up these important questions, which I hope is just the beginning of a conversation that we need to have, and not just a lecture, because I think there's so many really difficult challenges that you've posed to us as academics, as communities, as society. And how do we bring society and communities into this conversation so that these changes become meaningful for our lived realities? And then a very warm thank you to Joost for being our chair of the committee and for chairing the session and for asking those very provocative questions and creating the forum for this lecture to happen, as well as the rest of the Academic Freedom Committee. I think everyone in the committee has been instrumental in getting this lecture together, and also kind of having very important debates and discussions around some of the things that we have raised today. And I hope we will create more platforms to engage on this, not just in the higher echelons of the university, but in communities as well. Also, thank you very much to Prof. Bettina Janse van Vieren. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate your presence today, and I think it's a lot of these things sit with you and in your department, so I hope some of these challenging questions will be engaged with at that level and with us as well. And then we cannot have these functions without people like Berenice and our other colleagues who have supported and made this event possible. Thank you so much for your organization. This really helps us as academics to do our work better. So thank you so much for that. I think I've covered everyone, yes?
Yeah, except yourself. Thank you, yourself.
And we really hope to see you at the next event that we have. All the best. Ngiyabonga.
The University of Johannesburg. The future reimagined.